Aisha, you have to unmute yourself.
You have to unmute yourself, Ayesha.
Oh, sorry. Right now, am I unmuted? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, thank you everybody for joining what is usually a postprandial nap time, because even though forced immobility and incarceration in the home has many downsides, I think an afternoon nap is most welcome. Uh, Thank you, Juma and Albina and the CHRI for hosting this. This is a great honor for me. And in some sense, it is very fitting that what is the next generation of uh, women activists and academics are hosting this, I think, very touching discussion for me personally, of course, because these two are my friends. So Anis Kidwai is perhaps best known for her searing partition memoir, Azadi Ki Chhao Mein, which was published in 1974 after looking for a publisher for 25 years. And it took another 30 years for the book to be translated. As a granddaughter, of course, I like to believe that it was waiting for me. But the book, when it had some success, and it brought into its readers' lives what was a woman's take on the on long partition and its violence, particularly against women. The role of women and other civil society students, civil society activists, in stopping the spread of communal violence, and about the rescue of abducted women. Uh, it's a non-fiction piece of work. It's a memoir. It's a literary piece of work as well. And this book, most of all for me, because she's also my paternal grandmother, a dadi. Uh, this book introduces us to a very interesting personality who is grieving the murder of her husband in the partition violence, who uses the values of her Muslim faith. In fact, she says Islam and Insaniyat hai, or Insaniyat and Islam. And that's her. And her nationalist politics. To communicate both a personal and a political worldview that is both faithfully honest and critical about what happens in that long partition, and yet at the same time deeply empathetic and completely free of rancor. This book, which is I have entitled "The Dust of the Caravan," taking from one of the sections of this book, um, is what is about where a woman like Anis comes from. So the family, the culture, the politics that produced her persona, and as she wrote about it in her own words. So there's very little in the main translation per se that I've added a few connecting phrases sometimes. Unlike Azadi, this book was not conceived of as a manuscript. The one that is published in English, the English Dust, was not conceived of a manuscript in exactly this form. Anis Kidwai, before her death in 1982, was writing a memoir which was called Caravan, which is Dust of the Caravan, which remained incomplete and was published posthumously. It was not crafted in a manuscript. So that's the first part of this book, and which takes us from her birth. This takes us from her birth in Barabanki in 1906, UP, up to her life at the age of 20, that is 1926. And what I have done is it's different from the Dust of the Caravan in the Hobare Karma text, is that from her other writings, I have interwoven at least three other essays about people who she wrote about separately, which were contemporaneous to the period of the Dust of the Caravan. And so this was a book that was from essays from a book that were published in 1976, Ab Jinke Dekhne Ko. The book then does a little bit of a jump, and it comes to a long extract from the previously printed translation, but a different narrative, if you want, because that's a big book, or from In Freedom's Shade. And it closes with three essays, two in the form of an afterlife of partition. That is, two characters which I think are emblematic of who Anis was, both as a counterpoint and as somebody whom she took as a role model. An essay on Saifuddin Kichlu, one of the heroes of the Indian freedom movement, and his tragic silence, and the silencing of Mridula Sarabhai. The final essay is in the form of an appendix. It's an essay that Anis wrote in 1931, which was called The Search for a Wife, but readers who will read it will be struck by the remarkable similarity and difference with Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussein's Sultana's Dream. And this is Anis's dream, and it's different in its politics, but not in its aspirations. So in her lifetime, it would not be incorrect to say that, like the hundreds of Muslim women that Anis, like Muslim women who wrote in popular magazines, because Anis would have been considered a minor writer. Many of you may know that there was a long tradition of Muslim women writing in Urdu, in particular, because Islam is a religion of the word, and literacy came to Muslim women, religion of the written word, actually. And the injunction is for Muslims to read. So Muslim women were taught to read Arabic and Persian and Urdu. And because there was, in Awadh at least, there was a rich culture of poetry and novels, and well, a short story came later. And so Anis was, even though she was only formally educated till the age of 11, by, as you will see in Ghubar-e Karwan, by the time we reach about 1918, 1920, schools have opened for Muslim girls, even in her ancestral village. But she would have still been considered a minor writer, and in fact, when Quratul Haider writes on her death, after her death, Quratul Haider writes an essay in memoriam for her. She talks about how the Urdu canon is really constructed by misogyny, and its robust tradition seems to be a partition of Urdu literature into a mardana, men's quarters, and a zanana, a women's quarters kind of literature, and women writers were ignored. She mentions others. But Haider says that, like many others, Anis Kidwai was a Bibi who didn't care for either critical acclaim or eulogies, and she wrote throughout her life. What I think marks out Anis Kidwai, and many of these writings are just not known, so I will say it tentatively. What marks out Anis Kidwai is the fact that she writes women into popular social and political history. So the first part of the first section of this book, The Dust in the Caravan, is really an exercise of populating the world that we know, that we have heard from the tales of men about what the Mandana war, what the Zanana war, what the secular culture of Awadh was, what was that syncretism, with a whole other narrative of women. And women of all kinds, not only women like little Anis, who grows up in those 20 years, a truculent little girl who both is admiring of the women that she meets in the Zanana and sees it as a place of incarceration. It's an inside-out view of the Zanana. Not only is a place of refuge, it is also a place with embodied by little Anis, as something that, as a place that critically looks out and is conscious of its own exclusion. Like many other Muslim women of the period, there is a relationship which is fraught with a feeling of exclusion, of not being able to do political participation. And when we leave Anis in Gobare Karma, we leave her just having gotten out a little. But when she gets out, when we meet her again 20 years later, we meet her participating in a future that she never imagined, which was the Delhi in partition and her work with abducted women. Since I know that there'll be many, there'll be a lot of discussion around these issues, I will not dwell on exactly what happens, and I would encourage you to buy the book either in e-form or whenever it comes out. But I'd just like to close by just saying a few words about what I myself have done. One, as a editor translator, I have created a new manuscript from Gobare Caravan, which didn't exist before. But also, I hope that in the notes that I have given to this volume and in the introduction, try to situate to further the project that Anis had on writing a history of political ideas, of social trends, of notions of the family, which includes women, and which shows that this project that Anis started, which I think that many young academics and writers have continued actually, is to include, to flesh out that history, to show that what she writes about has a historical basis, that and I'm talking here about popular history, not academic history, that our sense of what is the history of at least particular regions like Awadh and the syncretic traditions that are so much touted and seem to be so much in danger, then what we have had thus far are just partial histories. And if women's critique, women's agencies, and women's inscription of themselves into these histories was to be allowed, encouraged, and because I think there is a lot of writing actually. And we would have a much deeper and richer notions of what democracy and democratization would entail. So I'll stop now because I'm sure that there are people will have many other things to say about the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayesha. We could probably move to the second speaker, who's the first discussant. Ghazala is here, right? Let me just...
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Ghazala. Hi.
All right. So let me begin with congratulating Ayesha. It's a really fascinating book, and that's the first word that comes to mind. Thank you to the organizers, the Jindal Global University, and the host of this event, Juma Sen and Albina Shakil, and last but not the least, Urvashi Batalia, for creating this platform for us to actually engage with these ideas and discuss these. My co-panelists, Professor Chakravarti, Professor Kirmani, all the other esteemed audience, prospective readers of this book. I'm neither an Urdu da nor an English literature wala, nor do I know much about the technicality of translation. So my comments today are from the perspective of being a social scientist who is trying to look into how history and memory have been used or produced as resources in nation building. And I don't remember exactly how, but my acquaintance with Anis Kidwai's work and persona began with actually my acquaintance first with Ayesha Kidwai as Januta president. There were probably some chance remark about the ongoing translation in some conversation. And I was curious because I happened to be researching Urdu women's magazines published in India in first half of the 20th century. So I looked up Anis. And frankly, I was interested more in her essays than her memoirs for the reasons that I will come to later. And I found her collection of essays, Nazre Khush Guzre, in Urdu, and I read some of the essays in her original voice without translation. In the preface of Nazre Khush Guzre, Anis mentions how her father had written an article in a magazine called Malumat. This article, I mean, this whole incident really fascinated me. And this article was titled "Biwi Kaisi Honi Chahiye." It probably listed, I haven't read that article, it's not part of that collection, but it probably listed some of the ideal qualities that a wife should have. And this same issue of this magazine carried another article by another gentleman on the same topic. So Anis doesn't say exactly when the articles were published, but that the magazine stopped publication in 1918. So it was fairly common in Urdu magazine those days to publish more than one articles with same title if the topic happened to catch fancy of the editors, readers, or even other writers. And these articles might be multiple perspectives or arguments in response to something, some provocation. So Anis found this particular issue of magazine from her mother, and in a typical laconic style, she says, बहरहाल ये वो मज़ामीन थे जिन्होंने शौहरों की क़िस्में कलम से निकलवाई. So she essentially wrote an article in response to these two articles in which she basically listed out what kind of or types of husbands. This article was actually published 13 years later. So she wrote it, but it wasn't published for a very long time in Malumat, the same magazine, when it resumed publication in 1931. And in 1936, she says, All India Radio broadcast a speech on the same topic, which is Biwi Kaisi Honi Chahiye, which again prompted Anis to add some points to her original composition on types of husbands, and that was also broadcast from All India Radio. So, as I said, my interest in Anis Kidwai was as an essayist, not so much her memoirs. And that was also my first encounter with her. And Nazre Khush Guzre has several essays and literary criticisms on poets and writers. It has character sketches of political figures, some of them quite serious, others very humorous. There's one particular that I really liked, which kind of, sort of ruminated about whether Maulana Azad was ever a child and what kind of a child would he make, because he was so such a serious kind of person. So it's a very it's full of endearment for him, but also humorously written. So these and other essay collections by Anis still remain untranslated, and they are largely forgotten. I would like to dwell a little bit on this point because writing per se is said to be a mode of participation in a movement for which opportunities to mobilize are limited because of various reasons. Let's say, for example, repression, or in terms of women or women's movement, what is called biological availability due to constraints of caregiving or reproductive roles. And women's writing is thus an important cultural manifestation of their agency. As such, metaphorical and poetic writing may be an effect of actually limits on women's expression in a society as to what are the acceptable forms of speech. And such writing or fiction or poetry has largely dominated in feminist cultural expression around the world when compared to, let's say, for example, journalistic expressions by women. So this is not to say whether, the more literary literature or fiction and poetry is more superior, or journalist expressions are less, sort of important, but just to observe that this is so. Now, this body of writing, that is fiction, etc., is preferred when it comes to feminist research and recovery of forgotten histories, etc., even when it is not really required as a political strategy for a movement. And then, of course, there is the specter of Muslim woman who is suppressed and plagued only by Islam and Muslim men. Little attention is paid to the possibility that Muslim women can also have concerns other than the alleged repressed sexuality, which is often portrayed as having a totalizing effect on their lives. Some notable exceptions in Indian Muslim women writers of that particular time are autobiographies. But here too, the language of only certain kind of rebellion is credited with agency, because that is what fits into the prevalent framework of Western liberal feminism. For this reason, only that writing by Muslim women received considerable attention, which was around forbidden or taboo subjects. In such a situation, it is clear that only writers like Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain, Ismat Chughtai, Rashid Jahan have managed to remain in the memory of the nation as Muslim women writers, and the journalists, the essayists of women's periodicals who wrote feature articles, travelogues, reports on current affairs, international politics, analytical articles, even articles about ecology, etc., have completely slipped from public memory into oblivion. Anis's memoirs being available in transition, that's one point that I wanted to make. But the next point that I want to make is about this particular book. Her memoirs that are now available in translation, they also signify for the readers some continuity in this regard, but also some breaks. From the point of view of my own interest in this particular text, Anis breaks some of the myths about herself individually and others about the public sphere that Muslim women writers or activists of the day constituted. In several articles about Anis or articles that refer to her writing that I could access and read, actually mentioned that she got her education from overhearing or listening into the teacher actually teaching only her brothers and not her. This book has several insights about, insights about not only what was the reality of her own education in her family, but about the women, about how women of the time pursued and acquired knowledge in the cultural elite households of the time. Anis's own struggle present an account of the variable ways in which practices of everyday life presented to her a tactical resource to preserve a space for her specific, very distinct, and she keeps talking about it, that she was different, that she had disdain for the prevailing sort of culture and how women were supposed to behave. But that space that she created for her distinctive mode of thinking and doing in the face of this otherwise dominant culture in which she was supposed to fit. Also, in the last chapter of the memoir, when she mentions going to a gathering of women writers who actually regularly wrote in the pages of these magazines, and she was excited about recognizing them from their names, then also being recognized herself as one among them. We know that Anis's struggles and her successes were not only hers. She was not the only one. There were other women writers who were struggling and negotiating with the same milieu. The point about segregation of Zanana and Mardana that Chughtai makes, and Ayesha mentions in the introduction, it rankles a little bit. It rankles not only because the life world, because it is actually about the life world of rich cultural elite Muslims of North India. You can imagine that the poorer and lower caste non-elite Muslim families did not experience this kind of segregation, but also that even in these elite families, it was not as totalizing and completely unbreached as these women themselves actually keep complaining. The women are cognizant of their repressed selves. They are cognizant of their rebellious selves, their expressive selves. But Anis also shows us her more enterprising or entrepreneurial self, which, though not consciously constructed, it involves a conception of her authentic yet unattainable self. And this is tempered with a collective construction of enterprise culture. She was not the only one who was doing it. There were other women writers, activists, or even regular, women who stayed at home, homemakers, who were constructing this enterprise culture where there was negotiation about which ways of personal life and action were acceptable. And the resources for this negotiation came not only from rebellion against gender discrimination or from anti-colonial struggle, but also from more mundane vagaries of life, such as in case of Anis, poverty and death. So overall, my impression from reading the memoirs, the early chapters of the memoirs, her book, actually resonate quite similar to the description of cultures of Muslim elite households in North India, not only of that time, but those of half a century before, as in Intizar Hussain actually describing Muslim families and women in Muslim families in Shahjahanabad during the Mughal time before the Sepoy Mutiny. The book is titled Dilli Tha Jiska Naam, that Faiz and I have translated. But also, it continued almost half a century later, as I read recently in the memoirs of Sadia Dehelvi, which she wrote in English, the descriptions about, huge mansions, so many relatives, a house feeling like a hotel, taking care of the relatives as if they were part of the family, the servants, and how they were so dear to their employers. They were so well respected and loved, etc., etc. So that's kind of very, very, sort of common. But it is a description of the everydayness of the politics in her family in the later chapters, and her own impressions of what was going on around her, the way she was eagerly following the news and her yearning to join in. That's what really fascinated me. And I really wish that we had a description of her time in the Parliament of India. That would have been invaluable, what she saw there, what the interaction she had outside the parliamentary proceedings on the sidelines and the wings of the parliament. But then, when are all our wishes granted? The last point that I want to make is about a little bit about the translation. And from my own translation work, it's easy enough for me also, somebody untrained in translations, the skill or craft or the science of translation. It's easy to understand that it's not just the act of getting a narrative from language A to language B, so that that community could also read it, but a cultural act that has the potential to that can transform public sphere and reformulate subjectivity, tradition, etc., of how things are seen. It shows the political side of things. And reading Dust of the Caravan, I was reminded of how Quratul and Heather translated her own work, Aag Ka Darya. Interestingly, she wrote Aag Ka Darya in Pakistan, and when she translated or transcreated it into English as Rivers of Fire, she had actually come back to India by then. And if we see what she entirely omits from the English version and how she translates what she retains, and several scholars have actually pointed it out, that it is like reading of Quratul and Heather's own notion of what the nation is. The translation is actually done in place, in the national community. And I don't have the time to go into the details of this, but through writing and revising, Heather was in a sense interacting with her readers and critics as a national community. And of course, Anis and Ayesha Kidwai are two different persons, but they are related and connected in certain ownership and anxiety about how this book ought to be read. I kept actually thinking about this when I read the notes that are given, very detailed, fascinating, amazingly researched notes actually at the end of the book, which I think ought to have been highlighted even more in the book. But that's where I also got that anxiety about how readers should read the book. For one, the book could be read as a response to critics or historians who've contributed to keeping the discourse not just about Anis but about Muslim women what it is. And it is as if both Anis and Ayesha are traversing multiple nations that India has been across space and across time. I think I'll stop here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ayesha.
Thank you, Ghazala.
Thank you so much, Ghazala Jamil. Now, without any further ado, it's over to Nida. Nida Kirmani, welcome, and it's over to you.
Okay. Can you all hear me and see me? All right. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me to this amazing panel and for giving me the opportunity to read this book. I think being in Pakistan, you kind of, I often feel like we're left out of a lot of the discussions that are taking place across the border. And I'm sure it's, not deliberate, but I really do appreciate the organizers for inviting me today and for recognizing the kind of shared history and the fact that this memoir or this this text is important for both India and Pakistan, especially for both feminists and for historians on both sides of the border. So I really appreciate that recognition. I do feel a little bit out of my depth as a sociologist. My own work was on contemporary locality in Delhi that many of you would know called Zakir Nagar. But it was kind of an ethnographic approach to that space. So I'm not in any way a historian. But I do think that, like Dr. Ghazala said, this text is very important in moving us away from one of the tendencies in discourse that I was also trying to work against, which is this kind of picture of the Muslim woman as oppressed and shrouded behind the burqa, and the kind of cliched ways in which Muslim women end up getting written about across the social sciences, not just in sociology and anthropology, but also in history as well. But my comments are going to be really, really brief, and I hope you don't mind, which maybe is good because then we can have more time for discussion, and especially with Professor Kidwai, who I'd love to hear more from in terms of, the process of translation and the difficult feat that she undertook, and hats off to her for doing that. I didn't realize Anis Kidwai was from Barabanki, and actually our families are somehow distantly related as well. So it was really also kind of a personal journey to read the book and to think about that time and think about perhaps what my own family was doing. My Nana was also Congress supporter, and he used to edit a newspaper in Lucknow. And I was thinking about what my Nani was doing, because that's also in the way we talk about our family histories. It's rare that the support work that women were doing counts as a kind of political activity as well. And I think that Anis Kidwai's memoir really brings up that important aspect of political movements and political organizing that is so often overlooked, which is the work that women are always doing behind the scenes, the unpaid labor, the support work that never gets acknowledged. What happens when male family members go to jail, or when men are so involved in political activities outside of the home? How are women affected by that, and how is their unpaid labor at home crucial to supporting these kinds of political movements? So I think Anis Kidwai's work really brings that out in a beautiful way, in a way that's rarely acknowledged in the way that we write our histories, or the way that the histories of anti-colonial movements are written. I think the text is just really beautiful in terms of moving us away from thinking about the Zanana as this kind of cloistered space of oppression, and to think about how women within the Zanana, who from the upper classes, were also in so many ways resisting, and her constant frustration throughout the text that we see coming through so beautifully, that this yearning to be involved in political activities more, and the frustration that she wasn't allowed to do that. I think what's so significant about the book is about the memoir in particular is how it disturbs the way that we understand history, how we think about what counts as a historical text, how when women's writing is talked about, as Professor Kidwai also points out in her preface to the book, it's relegated to this kind of Zanana in writing as well. But how a memoir is such an important historical text, and how we never really think about that as a kind of historical text. So what counts as history? This really, I think, helps us disturb our understandings. And I hope that it's a book that is read not just by feminists who follow the publications of Zuban, but also by mainstream historians and male historians who rarely take into account these kinds of texts in their understanding and their teachings of South Asian history. I think sitting on this side of the border as well, it's just so amazing to think about that time not so long ago when this kind of intermingling of religious boundaries, sectarian boundaries, the Shia-Sunni divide as well, that I heard about through my own mother's stories in Lucknow, of the kind of intersectarian intermingling that went on, the celebration by Sunnis of Muharram, or the observation at least of Muharram, not celebration, which now even in Pakistan is so rare. And we've just seen a hardening on both sides of the border of the religious and intersectarian boundaries. To think of that time not so long ago, and to hear it described in the way that Anis Kidwai does, is a really important reminder of how far we've gone away from that, but perhaps also can push us to thinking about how maybe we can bring back some of that intermingling. We're doing it now with Zoom, I think, during the pandemic, in which I can actually be on a panel in Delhi, and I don't have to worry about getting a visa. So that's maybe we are pushing back in our own ways and taking inspiration from Anis Kidwai as well. But I think it's it's so crucial that we read this text in Pakistan as well, and remember that this was our history not so long ago. And not just the Hindu-Muslim divide that's always spoken about, but the divide between Shias and Sunnis as well, that has become so rigid in Pakistan over the last decades. What I found so beautiful about the writing as well was the kind of documentation of everyday forms of resistance that women were undertaking, that she herself was also undertaking, but also the women around her. And how she would kind of move back and forth between the macro level political resistance that was going on and the micro resistances that women were undertaking in their own homes, in the Zanana space. And I think that kind of connecting that as those kinds of politics, the big macro politics that we always hear about, but the micro level politics that women are also constantly engaged in terms of pushing against those gender boundaries. I think that was something that really spoke to me and came through really clearly in the text. And a moment that I just found really, moving was when she burned her bridal dress. And I thought, wow, what an amazing multi-layered form of resistance, so that she was kind of resisting the colonial regime, but she was also resisting, there was a kind of gendered resistance there as well, which I found quite amazing. I also thought that the talking about the politics, what happens behind the scenes, the arguments in the family about political activism, these are things that never get spoken about. And to talk about how men within that private space were also engaging in politics, how that was affecting their family life. This is never really brought about in kind of male-dominated histories of anti-colonial movements or in histories of the subcontinent. She was amazingly intersectional in the way that she spoke about her surroundings. So there was, no kind of romanticization of the kinds of divisions that she was seeing around her, divisions around class, divisions around caste, that she brought out so naturally and so personally in her writing. And the issue of caste amongst Muslims as well, which is rarely spoken about by social scientists. And she was doing this, so many decades ago, which I think Anis Kidwai clearly very ahead of her time. And I think she's, we can learn from her as social scientists as well right now, kind of bring in that critique that she was bringing in well before mainstream social scientists started doing that. I'm really glad that Professor Kidwai chose to end the book with that beautiful utopian essay, because I think after the kind of violence of partition that followed the memoir, it was nice to have a kind of uplifting end and to think about this kind of feminist utopia that she imagined. And I was thinking about a few weeks ago, Dr. Durba Mitra did a talk for us at LUMS, again on Zoom. But she was talking about how Sultana's dream is, how the writings of women, and she was referring to Sultana's dream, are often relegated to, fantasy or to memoir or, to kind of digest, where the writings of male social scientists are seen as historical fact. But she was pushing us to think about these fantasies as a way also of why don't we see these also as a kind of social scientific document? Why are the fantasies of men written as history and written as social sciences? And why are the fantasies of women like Anis Kidwai not treated with the same kind of respect? And so, just to kind of congratulate Professor Kidwai again for this endeavor, for bringing this text to our attention. I hope that it's available in Pakistan. I hope that people here read it, and it's not that we can challenge the boundaries that have grown so rigid between the two countries over the last decades, with more of these panels. And I hope that more of this kind of writing, I hope this inspires more people to translate the writings of Muslim women from this time. Thank you. Thank you for including me.
Thank you so much, Nida Kirmani. It was a pleasure having you here. So now it's over to Professor Uma Chakravarti.
So how many minutes, because I missed part of it, my computer crashed and I had to go and run and set up another one. So I don't know, I missed some of the stuff that Ayesha was speaking about in the beginnings of Ghazala. But how many minutes?
So you have, 12 minutes, 12 to 15, essentially.
Okay, all right. All right.
We'll nudge you at 12.
Yeah, all right. Okay. So first, I think I should flag the fact that I'm the only person in this entire panel, and perhaps in the entire audience, who actually lived through partition. I was born in 1941, so I was 6 years old when partition happened. And I have my own stories about partition, living in Delhi and seeing the violence around me, which will come back into our discussion in a bit. Now, of course, the most stunning piece of writing that I've seen on the partition is actually Anis's In Freedom's Shade, the one that finally, after so much time, Ayesha managed to translate into English and allow people like us who don't read Urdu actually access to this wonderful book. Now, as a historian, my remarks are really going to come from the sense of having watched history and being a historian. It's an incredible piece of writing. That Azadi Ki Chhaw Mein is an incredible piece of writing. But what Ayesha has extracted in for this new work is a combination of multiple things. I mean, it's a combination. She's extracted some stuff from Azadi, and she's also brought in other pieces of writing. So it's a really interesting collection from the point of view of feminist history, feminist historian, but it's also very deeply political because Anis, having lived through partition and events leading to the partition, would have made her acutely sensitive to the politics of her time. So to that extent, I think it's quite extraordinary. I mean, she, whatever else she may have done and successfully done in all her pieces of writing, here she has the eye of the historian who's documenting her time, all the time and all the time. And it's an extraordinary piece of documentation. So that's the power. So now, although I don't think that piece of writing is included in Ayesha's preface is really good because she manages to put into it all the, let's say, sexy questions around, writing and translation and the divide between how men look at history and how women look at history, or how women write and so on. And she has these nice barbs, when she says even Mushirul Hasan doesn't see the power of Anis's writing, and he treats it as it doesn't set the Jamna on fire. Now, of course, I don't know how many pieces of writing set the Jamna on fire, but to me, this certainly did. So I see that as a really offensive remark, actually. Be that as it may. One of the interesting things that she picks, that Ayesha does, because she hasn't, really done the exhaustive job of doing everything that Anis has written and pulled out from it all the things that might speak to us today. And I hope there'll be a fuller edition of Anis's writings, because I think they're extraordinary. But I was struck by the fact of the contemporariness of many things that Ayesha does flag. And Ayesha, obviously writing from today's vantage point, she is drawing upon today's history to look back at Anis and what Anis is witnessing and what Anis is recording. So I was struck by the little account of the situation in Assam, that is, as part of her parliamentary role, she is aware of the citizenship question. Now, just incredibly, just look at the poignancy and the, what would you call it, the prescientness of, what she sees at that point of time, is that questions of citizenship is already in the 50s, being deeply discussed, and she's sensitive to that. She's actually brought it in over there. So I found that very, very, it gave me goosebumps, the idea that here's this woman who records that as part of and that Ayesha thankfully put it into the preface, because it's not in the any piece of writing that she extracts. So that was really quite nice. The other point that I think Ayesha manages to capture is Anis's bearing witness to not only pre-partition, partition, but also post-partition and the making of the nation. So in that sense, I think the whole discussion around what kind of nation should we have. So while she has stepped out of Parda and entered the political world, is there a way in which, she's acutely sensitive to the fact that the secular nation that you want to build is something that is constantly slipping away, and it's slipping away from day one, literally from day one, because not only does the partition happen, but everything thereafter also is something that is fraught. So actually one can see and feel like a community, a person. I mean, I may not belong to that community, but I can see myself in some ways watching that drama unfold in front of myself, in which I am being systematically sort of, elided from the public sphere in a certain kind of way. And I think that's so beautifully and marvelously done in everything that Anis wrote. So it's in that context that I will look at the selection. Now, I think Ayesha decided to extract two bits from the In Freedom's Shade, that is from Azadi Ki Chhaaw Mein. The first one is absolutely riveting, and it's really extraordinary because it is the account of Anis watching and not being able to do anything about the fact that there is danger to her husband, and Shafi himself comes out as such an extraordinary figure who simply does his duty, sits over there regardless of the kinds of challenges, and you can see she's writes beautifully and has used the letters very effectively to capture the quality of this man who just carries on doing what he has to, even as he's so unable to turn the force of history in a direction in which it could be, we could all look back on that moment and say, yes, there was something that could have been done, and it was being done. And there is an inexorable way in which, through the letters and through everything that Anis uses in describing that account of how finally he dies. I mean, that including the most moving moment in which he said that his friends buy him a ticket for the 8th of October, but it's on the 7th of October that he gets killed, and that he's actually stood there, done his duty at the end. And for me, living through my times now, and some of you will understand what the sentiment from which I'm speaking now, this very powerful line that he says, all things pass, this too shall. And it's like his acceptance, in a sense, of what is going to happen to him, and also what is happening to his family, but also to the nation at that point of time. And I think that's most moving. I see that as a kind of recall to today, because I often tell myself, drawing from the Buddha, that everything passes, and this time will also pass. And we're going through a similar time at the moment, where we are being tested all the time by the politics of our time. So that description of the moment of the how to call it. I mean, I don't even have words for it. I mean, the moment when he's killed is extraordinarily poignant, as is the fact that she's devastated, and then she goes to see, and she says, like a girl going to her mother, she's gone to Gandhi, and Gandhi gives her that. She asks him, "What can I?" I mean, she's actually seeking a way in which she could actually live past her times and be able to do something about it. I think that's an extraordinary moment. Her bearing witness is what she bears witness, and her pen is fantastic. Her descriptions are amazing. She has a description of Gandhi when he's on his fast, and she's even describing his complexion, his visage. This is the historian, that is the historian of the moment. She's really bearing witness, and she describes this very, very movingly and eloquently about how he's looking at that point of time when Delhi is battling and killing each other. That is, killing is going on September, October in Delhi. She captures that wonderfully, as she does the fact that he goes on strike, he takes the fast, and then they fan out into the city. And I think it's extraordinary. Her description of going to, I think it's the Jhandewala region, you know, where there is the Muslim, it's that area where Eidgah ke paas, you know, there is, and a lot of people have come from the other side and they are settled in this area. So there's a lot of tension between the Muslim population there, which is trying to go, and the Hindu population that has come from the other side and is there. There's this incredible tension. And the description of how Subhadra Joshi and Anis deal with that moment is like a most powerful account. It's like the Delhi riots today. It's like, you know, it's like everything that we can think of as recall. It's like, and much more so. And then there's a moment she says, "You can kill me if you like." She describes herself as being a Muslim, and it's the Hindu crowd that is around her. And she says, "You can kill me if you like, but listen to what I'm saying." And then some young woman throws her arms around around Anis, and she says, "Mataji, why will we kill you?" And they hug her, and I was in tears, because that's the moment in which you suddenly turn the sentiment and the feeling that is, you know, which is the madness that is driving all around. So I found that absolutely riveting. I mean, the description of Delhi in those months, in those is extremely, extremely powerful. So then the other thing I'd like to say is that, yeah, you know, that Anis, Ayesha has extracted, which is on the abductions. And yeah, it's good. I mean, I think the feminists were fantastic because they pioneered this breakthrough in partition studies by raising questions which had, you know, gone underground, and which, of course, male historians were both uncomfortable with and perhaps did not do. And feminists like Urvashi, Ritu, and Kamla did that pioneering work in which they put the abducted woman at the center of the partition narrative. But I sometimes wonder that, having done that and done it so successfully, has that become emblematic of everything that the partition experienced and reduced actually the range of see, we are very bad. I think we quickly go to something becomes successful and we only cite that. It's like Partha Chatterjee has to be cited by page 3 by every Indian who's writing her piece in the United States of America on the gender question. Page 3, if Partha Chatterjee is not already there, you can change my name, okay? That's it. It's a kind of kowtowing that you do to the cat. But actually, there's so much more. And in the book itself, I mean, you read Azadi Ki Chhaav Mein, and for me, the most moving chapter, and again, why? I was a child at the partition. So her description, her chapter on children is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. I don't know how many of you read it, but it's really moving account of how these children are coping with that situation. They don't understand what the hell is happening. You know, their arms are being cut off. They are losing their families. A brother is being taken away. His little brother has been left behind. It's like so inexplicable what the hell is happening. And she has this wonderful account of a little girl who's asked her name, and she's asked, "So what's your name?" And she says, "Sita Hasina." "What is your father's name?" She gives the same, ek Hindu name, ek Muslim name. What is your mother's name? The same combination. That is a Hindu and a Muslim. This girl has decided that this is about identity. This conflict is about Hindu-Muslim. So I am neither, or I'm both. You know, so this kid is actually found a solution for herself. And she then takes the child to Gandhiji and she says, this little girl is going to cause a riot because both sides will claim her, you know, and say that you have done this with her. And then she's sent off to Kasturba's girls' school in Mehroli. Now, it's extraordinary. Just that one little vignette, to my mind, is explaining the dynamic of the partition in such extraordinary ways. I found that really very beautiful. As also a little story of, and it's not in the collection, it's not in the extraction that Ayesha has done, but I refer you to go and read that also, please, in Azadi Ki Chhaav Mein. And then there's this little account of a little boy and a little girl who play cards. That's the way they live their time out from the hospital and whatever it is. And then one goes off, and the little boy, the little girl then gives away the cards, and she said, "I have no one to play the cards with now." And that's itself says so much about bonding and breaking up at that stage. I can't, even if I don't have time, 3 minutes I will take and talk about. I think the essay, the Kidwai essay, is beautiful. I loved it. It's really so moving. It's such a moving account of a family that is disrupted and it resettles, and what happens to the sense of self and the dignity with which you live. I think it's a beautiful extraction that I'm glad that you put it in over there. But I'm also so glad that you put Mridula Sarabhai. I think Mridula Sarabhai is the woman of our times. And it is something that we should all go back to. And I will try and sort of say, I would like to just do justice to her. Let me see. I did write it up, but I'm not so sure that I can find it. Just give me a second. And so actually, the Mridula Sarabhai bit is real. See, again, it speaks to me because I'm living in the today, as Anis is, as Ayesha is, as Ghazala is, as all of us are at this point. Preventive Detention Act. That's the issue. And it's there, and Mridula Sarabhai is standing up in 1950 and saying Preventive Detention Act, where you can incarcerate a person for 5 years without taking it to trial. And we put that into our constitution. We put preventive detention into our constitution, and we have allowed it to happen. And it was being tested by Mridula, who's speaking about Sheikh Abdullah. Try him or let him go. You can't do this. You can't do this. And then she's she's castigated as someone who's lost her reason. She's mad. She's lost it. All of that stuff. I tell you, it's like it actually speaks to today. What the hell is happening? So, and she writes, so the woman who was the heroine of the nation in retrieving abducted women was also the betrayer of the nation, as defined by Nehru in the Congress. Now, that's the irony of it. Now, we keep on claiming Nehru, but look at what he did as far as Kashmir and Sheikh Abdullah and Mridula is concerned. So Anis asks, was she a traitor or a patriot, a Deshbhakt? Referred to, and this is a woman that I think we should retrieve her and be doing whatever we can to celebrate her, because here's this woman who speaks. So here's someone who has 1 foot in India, 1 foot in Pakistan, and then she stands up in her time and speaks the way she does. See, I think that essay, including that, to me is the most political act that Ayesha performs at this point of time in the writing, and I think I'll just close on that note.
Thank you, Uma. I think that was very spirited. I'll just, I think, so we are formally, our 3 discussants have spoken, and now the mic goes back to Ayesha to respond. Ayesha, how much time would you need? 10 minutes? 10, 12? 12 is good?
You can go straight to questions if you want. I can just do like a 1 minute thing, because after these brilliant comments, I don't really have much to say. But if you would rather go straight to questions, that's fine too.
It's Alvina, what do you say? I'm fine with either, whichever you're comfortable with, Ayesha.
A couple of minutes for Ayesha, then we'll open for questions.
So thank you, all 3 of you. I am so honored, and I have to say my eyes are moist, because it's quite something that Anis, who I've lived with really for the last now 12, 14 years. And of course, the personal fulfillment of having your grandmother with you in her written words is something else. And in my life, she continues to help me. But I think that thank you, Uma, in particular, and Ghazala, and for picking up on the the politics of doing this translation. There is not a vast oeuvre, but it's a pretty big oeuvre. And I had to um, choose in terms of selections what I wanted to speak about and how much of burden that I wanted to put of my politics and my despair and hopelessness that we all feel. It's not only mine at this current juncture. How much of it to put on Anis Kidwai and to burden her story with the resonance to the present. But it seems like we have not moved an inch. And sometimes for each of us, the weight of that sorrow seemed, unbearable. But her story is one of progress and of fulfillment. And the interesting thing that I just like to flag out, which I think will cover everybody's comments, is that all these texts really that I'm included in here are all come see the light of day in the 1970s. Nehru is dead. Um, India has turned secular. There is a English pamphlet which I can make available, which is somebody translated and did such a bad of translation job of the translation of her speech that she made in the 1974 that was published by Sampradayakta Virudhi Andolan, which just shows you there is both disillusionment, uh, a sense that something great was accomplished in the time because she was very happy with her literary success. She knew she has a very confident voice actually. And but it's also a time when the first period of reflection about where have we reached, I think is happening in India, and there is more space now for women to speak. So the Kichlu essay, which in some sense is a counterpoint to Anis, because she has a beautiful line there about it towards the end of the essay about the fate of nationalist Muslims.
Yeah.
She said some were forever displaying their wounded breasts, some were stupefied, some were co-opted, only few could stay the course. And her course, which along with Mridula Sarabhai and Subhadra Joshi, there were just a few people who stayed the course according to her, of knowing what a democracy and democratization meant, what secularism, which is not the word that she would have used. I think she would have used communal amity rather than secularism. And so that all of those essays and even the Azadi text actually comes alive in the 70s. And I think that for me to have translated it now in the last 2 years has been a terrible emotional roller coaster for everybody. Because there are so many of the themes from the past and an inflection that the present is giving, which is so incredibly cruel and seems even worse than before. But as Shafi Ahmad Kidwai said, this too shall pass. But I don't think that we can do it without help. We can't do it without the help of knowing that there was another past. And for that, I think voices like Anis Kidwai are very, very important because they could get past it and look to the future. Once about a year or two ago, Urvashi had in a panel discussion that we were on, which Urvashi was chairing, on some article about abducted women that I wrote, looking at Mridula Sarabhai's writing. Urvashi asked me that, so what was Anis Kidwai like? Was she sad? And because a lot of women who worked with abducted women who lived through partition violence were disillusioned and sad, and it's was it something in their lives that blighted it. And I mean, nobody ever asked me that question before. And it was a brilliant question because actually Anis Kidwai was always hopeful. And I think it's, writing it down, writing it out, writing yourself, even your despair into history. Right? That is somehow, that frees one. So I'm very grateful for all your comments. There's nothing more that I have to say, but I would be happy to respond. Just one more point, Umar. Kamla Ben Patel also reports a girl in Pakistan who reports, who gives two names, one Hindu, one Muslim. Right? So there's, it was ubiquitous because this whole game of identity is terrible. And just like you, so I thought when I was extracting, I wondered whether I should put in the abducted woman section. It's actually very good writing. And whether I should not. Because one concern, Ghazala and I have often talked about it, that Azadi Ki Chhau Mein is not only about.
Yeah.
It makes the case in Anis's version of India's secularism and equally strongly the case for India's Muslims.
Yeah.
Right? And not as identity. Not as, an identity marker which is, allows. Yeah. But I put it in because I needed to cover the text of Azadi Ki Chhau Mein so that I would get that narrative and come to the post-partition life and Mridula Sarabhai. But I would encourage everybody to read the other book too. Thank you all. Albina, back to you.
Yes, so now we'll just open the house for questions. As you can see on top of your screen, on Teams, there is a hand icon. So in case anybody has questions, we'll just request you to please raise your hands. Or if you want to type it in the chat box, that is perfectly fine too.
Sumit has a question.
Yes, Sumit, go ahead.
Hi, everyone, and thanks to Albina, Juma, for organizing this, as also all of the panelists for sharing their insights and commentaries about a work that seems incredibly interesting and fascinating to look up. I'm interested in intersectional subject formation. And as we know, as Nida Kirmani briefly referred to intersectionality, of how the consciousness of caste and class is something that is available for readers and insights around these intersections. And as we know, with an intersectional subject formation, especially that which is done by anybody else, could be characterized differently, as it could be done by authors themselves, especially through their lived experiences. In contemporary times, as we attempt to trace the intersection of gender and religion in, say, in triple talaq case, and ways in which the subject formation of Muslim women happens, can we draw from the writings, especially of the of an anti-colonial movement and of the post-colonial times? Can we trace some of those understandings of intersectionality, of intersectional subject formations, especially those that might be pushing back against the existing and the dominant feminist positions, for example, especially that might be pushing back against the prevailing nationalist sentiments, especially that which in contemporary times might be seeking to pursue progressive ideals through, pursuits of, say, triple talaq case. And so are there traces of such intersectional critiques that we are able to recover from works as these?
So Ayesha, would you like to take that question? Or any of the panelists?
Ayesha, you have to unmute yourself, I think.
Right. I'm not entirely sure that from this work, but maybe I'm not reading it closely enough. I think that Anis is, she's great, but I don't think she's that great. Certainly, I mean, I can, because for her, what seems to be available is a universal category woman, which is not necessarily intersectional. In that, so in Azadi Ki Chhawein, in Infinite Shade, she talks a lot about caste. She doesn't exactly know what to do with it because she is very Gandhian. So she says Harijan. And well, everybody said Harijan then. But she speaks mainly about Muslim men. Harijan men, and Harijans as a community. In this text, she speaks about, and I really love that chapter about the kind of labor that is provided in the village economy by various, actually it's a list. If you look at tribes and castes of the center of the United Provinces, you'll see that many of the, actually everybody whom she mentions is there, and that shows that Uma says that she has a historian's eye. But the way that she speaks of we who are now scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, I mean, is to recognize the fact that they are doing unpaid labor, rather than the constitutive nature of caste in their social situation. She's also she finds it she doesn't actually ever write about sexual violence, for example, which is even when she's in Azadi Ki Chhawein, she is a person who can talk about the violence but will not detail the nature of the violence per se. There is zero pornography of violence in her. So I'm not sure that from her text. In fact, for me, I mean, and I say this in the preface also, given that she has just this universal category of woman available to her, what she sees is class much more than caste. She doesn't see caste. She knows it exists and that it organizes society. But maybe I'm not reading it closely enough. I don't know. Nida mentioned it, so she could come in.
Nida, would you like to take that up?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it, but I defer to Professor Kidwai, who's much closer to the text than I am. And I think that, like you said, Harijan was the word that was used at that time, though I don't fault her for using that language. But I think my pointing out the intersectionality bit was more just because there was so much of an acknowledgement of caste divisions, which
Yes.
at least I rarely saw in writings by Muslims. So I think for me that was something noteworthy, even if perhaps the politics around caste might not have been as progressive as we might like. But I think just that kind of constant acknowledgement of caste divisions around her and the acknowledgement of the unpaid labor that people from the lower caste and Dalits were doing, I think, is noteworthy, even if it might have been imperfect.
Any further questions? Or comments? Okay, then I have a question, Ayesha. I had the pleasure of reading both the books, Azadi Ki Chhaav Mein, as well as in English, in your translation, in Freedom's Shade, as well as this one. So what stood out to me, because I come from literature, and everybody who has spoken on the panel have been social scientists. It's said in literature that human beings are storytelling animals who live and die for their stories. And Anis Kidwai was certainly a storyteller because the personal life, or the personal, intensely personal, very intimate, vision that she has, which you said was an inside-out vision, from the Zanana outside, and yet sort of then giving a perspective, from inside to the outside. And I'm sure that stories that may have stayed on in family lore, the fact that you are translating it today, and how much it resonated, as Uma said, with today's situation, not just because in your preface you sort of make it resonate, but also because each of the chapters or each of the sections resonate so well. So it seemed to me like the oral storytelling tradition, virtually, where one knows the stories already, one knows what happens next, and yet there is the pleasure of listening and re-listening to the stories. So even though it's such a historical text, so contextual, yet there has been so much curiosity in today's times about who are these Muslim women who came out of their houses to protest for citizenship. Were they paid? Were they brought? Were they sent by their men? Were they guided by organizations? How did they do? Or were they subjective? Did they bring their own subjectivity? It so beautifully recounts, I thought, the entire question of how a very, very sort of how a girl grows up when she starts feeling discrimination with the boys in her house, the number of restrictions that are put on her, the religiosity that is taught to her, the morality that is taught to her, the number of people outside family she comes to terms with, how very, very political figures are assessed very personally or from within, the views of women. Are they good men? What kind of men are they? And yet from that perspective to step out, and to go out. So your sequence of how, there's a personal memoir from birth to sort of growing up to marriage to personal tragedies and loss, including losing a child, very early in life, to then, excerpts from Azadi Ki Chhaav Mein, to then the question of, the sort of heroes becoming the villains of the nation in a very, very short time, with Mridula Sarabhai and the essays on Kichlu, to her sort of utopian, almost feminist kind of utopia. So it resonated. It gave a lot of explanations, I think, for readers. It will satiate that curiosity that who on earth are these women who actually step out, who are still curious about, who these Muslim women are who have been inside their homes. Why do they come out? What do they see in it? Do they make rationale and sense, and very political, ideological sense? And I thought that you made the Zanana a place, the interactions among women almost give us more hope that women, have more of a Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb in them, in their upbringing, there is so much more intimate sort of interaction with, of Muslim women, with Hindu women, between rituals, etc. So I saw it primarily. Let me now come to my question. That I see it primarily through your translation as a very contemporary text and as a story that can, that almost came from the oral storytelling tradition, even though it's written and translated, which are stories that could be told again and again of the political and personal travails that Muslim women have been facing and are still facing in the country. But would you see it as more historical? Because the last book that you translated was seen as far more historical.
So I think that a lot is the same and a lot is different because whether we so first thanks Albina for the extensive comment, and I want to say that this was perhaps the hardest thing I've ever done, and I find my own professional discipline linguistics very hard, and this was far harder because Anis Kidwai, it's, I had like 40 pages of Urdu text, that's it, printed Urdu text, and maybe 10 handwritten pages. She has a great economy of expression. So it's, finding the right word. Also, what doesn't come out in a translation, which is really telling about people like Anis, also like Ismat, but it's, that's a more literary side. That it is the quality of Are Palti Maar Karke, we will betho and tell stories. That's her style, but then you don't say too much. So you don't do sequence. It's in 3 lines that just by the choice of words and the use of actually many languages. So from Awadh to English, because she knows some words, certainly, Hindi. So it's not possible to predict. It was a very different text to translate also from Azadi. Azadi has long descriptions. It has very clearly 2-3 registers. Here she's switching between voices of, when there are some parts of the narration which are, she's a little girl. Every part of the sequence is not revealed to her. So that lovely story about Nargis, who is throwing, discovered by her, and then suddenly they don't know what, she starts throwing stones at the little boys. It was very, very difficult, and I can't believe that it took me a year and a half to just translate that 40 page of printed pages of that text. And I think if I had to do it again, I would still have more changes to do, but I think it's so one point I wanted to make about the structuration of the text, right? So of course it is a very contemporary document. I mean, and literally it is in the last 1.5, 2 years, exactly what we have all felt. It started off as a historical text. Those of you people who know me, know I'm an impatient kind of person. So actually, there are many things I find tedious, like talking about not what you do, but what your antecedents are, etc. But when Anis tells that story relates to the present and to what we see. And I think I learned from, so in the organization, so when I started, this was that, and then the choice of the Azadi sections and the Kichlu and Midula Sarabai are directly influenced by events. But what Anis, I think, taught me was to understand also the differences from the present. So one of the greatest banes in her life is the fact that she has to go into Parda by the age of 9, 8 or 9, and and then her father died, and then she loses even the little kasbah that she was in, and is in Masauli and really incarcerated. In another 5 years, she's married. Her schooling stops, but she what she represents is the little girl who is seeing a political activity around her and wants to be part of the politics. There isn't, as Ghazala pointed out, there is, the undercutting of the narrative. She might get very irritated with, all the sequestering that's been done to her, but it never boils over into an open rebellion into the family. It's just when her two cousins, Rafi and Shafi, become politically active that some little doors open for her. But Muslim women, and that's the point, I think, if the text had continued, if Azadi had continued, she would have made this point, because the last section there is talking about what women did by supporting the men who are out in jail, and that they always wanted to step out. This is actually constantly a refrain even in Azadi. That Muslim women wanted to be political, of all classes, wanted to be politically involved. But the conservatism of their family, which didn't have anything to do with Islam, it just had to do with conservatism, and wouldn't allow them to. But one of the stories that she's, where I think we should flag from the present, the difference is the difference. So right now, hijab, burqa, the fact that more people are wearing it, and is something which is seen as a regressive step. And of course, you could have one reading of the Anis story about her desire to get away from the parda. And the burqa was a kind of a mobile parda which enabled mobility for Muslim women, and therefore early political participation in regions like Awadh. And that now, if it is adopted for entirely different reasons. So yes, there is a continuity. So understand that the political doesn't disappear just because people have faith, and that faith has altered. Certainly for Anis, in Anis's generation, many women moved from the parda to the burqa, and from then many elite women at least left the burqa entirely. And now if it is adopted for reasons of faith, not for the reasons of a restriction on their mobility, as votaries of this practice say. So that things have changed. But I think that the fact that there is still that possibility of an syncretic present, which might not be associated directly in a causal line with a syncretic past. And I don't mean syncretic as in melting pot. It's just knowledge about the other faith, other community, other caste, other religion. Anis is an example for that. So when I structured that book, I wanted to say that we end with Mridula Sarabhai from her writing in the 70s, but the 1931 story, which is where what happens in the political. So this is a story. It's very sweet. Apparently, 3 ladies have gone to the. It's her dream that 3 ladies have in the 1932 roundtable conference in England gone and done a coup. And these were actually the ladies, the women mentioned actually were people who were there at the roundtable conference, that they go and they win an independent country for Shiis. And the Shiis are very nice. They give His equal rights. They let the liberals off. And then what follows is a Supreme Court hearing where a man makes a requisition about what kind of a wife. So it's back to the theme that Ghazala talks about, which is that he is making a requisition saying he wants a wife there. And there's an imperious Begum Sahiba who rejects every single one of his demands. And in that process says women are allowed to talk back at men and say, we can't do this, we can't be parsimonious, we will be. And I think that for somebody like Anis, the change in the home was as important as the change outside. And I wanted to end with that essay because in my life, I have seen, I had the good fortune of being Anis's granddaughter when she was alive for 16 years. I have seen in her life how she changed the values of her entire family. There was no woman precursor to Anis, that women will have a politics, that women will do political activity, that they will not be accountable, that the change in family values, the way that, sexual violence in my family is talked about, the who are our friends, the fact that there were lots of women, unaffiliated by, marriage or by religion, that all of those things that bring the change back into the home. So the reason why I structured the book like this is that this story should be an oral narrative in itself. And I hope that, great grandchildren or mine will one day hear it, that there existed a woman who transformed herself through grief and through struggle, transformed her family, and made some attempt to transform the world that she lived in. Thanks, Albina.
So I wanted to just add to that, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
So one of the things that again connects back to our times is the way in which we have begun to feel a sense of hope with the young. And she has it all the time. It's a running thread in her writing. And I thought it was quite moving. I mean, like in a sense, history does come back to us, because Jamia is the seat of all the positive activism that she's able to draw upon, because it's the young from Jamia who come out in large numbers and support her in her work for the partition refugees. And among the most moving, I think, is the account of the dead man who can't be buried because there is no one to bury him. And yes, even the mullahs back off, everyone backs off. And then these women begin the process, and then these boys from Jamia suddenly appear and they complete the job. And I see that both as a metaphor for our times, as well as actually the manner in which she is able to bring out the best in others also. And it's completely irreverent, because she's saying, we've never done this before, but we'll do it. We'll do it if that, because everyone deserves a decent burial. So I think in all of those ways, I think there's a nice way in which we can start feeling. I've been one of those characters who's been saying कि देखो मेरे सामने तो कोई अच्छा नहीं होने वाला है, मैं तो थोड़े सालों में अल्लाह को प्यारी हो जाऊंगी, but तुम क्या करोगे? What is your generation going to do? Because you are the ones who have to live this thing. And it is the young who are actually today suddenly standing up and doing quietly the work that they have to do. And I see that as a very positive and hopeful thing. So, and on that note, I want to ask, why are these students of yours so silent, Juma?
I don't know. I don't blame them right now, because the entire class teaching has gone online. So that could be one reason. Zoom fatigue or MS Teams fatigue. It doesn't sound as good. Zoom fatigue is better. So I think there was a comment. And was this a hand raised? I don't recall. So there is a comment from Mohan Rao, not a question but a comment. Since I have not read this text, the panelists were so good. Uma brought tears to my eyes that they may just have blocked the sale of a copy. Thank you all very much. If there is other questions, we can take a few. I
guess people haven't read the book yet, so it's difficult.
Yes. So I think then the best thing to do is to buy the book and read it. And I have pasted the link to Zuban's site directly, so you can just go and buy the book. Maybe not now, but once the panel closes, and please read it. I have been reading it. I'm yet to finish it though, and it's really as fascinating as the panel today. Albina, do you want to close the panel? If there are no other questions, you're muted.
No, I just want to say that it was an excellent panel. So thank you, Ayesha. Thank you, Ghazala. Thank you, Nida. And thank you, Uma. And of course, I do want to thank Juma, because Juma did most of the legwork in terms of putting the panel together, and all the hard work that Juma put in. Urvashi is here right now. So thank you to Urvashi Butalia and to Zuban Books for making this possible for us. It's a privilege to be able to host this book launch in a way. So thank you so much to everybody, and especially to all the audience and all the students who joined us today for this very, very interesting discussion. And I'm sure that all of you will have your own takeaways from, about the book. But please read it. It's a very, very rich text, very evocative, I think, for each one of us for very, very different reasons. So it's very evocative. It makes a lot of sense, helps make sense. And as Uma said, helps find hope. So thank you so much to Ayesha, the translator, taken this effort to translate and brought another gem of a book for all of us to be able to read. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Everything's off.